and then I had my social responsibilities and everything else like that. But I still wanted to kind of, pursue some of my own creative ambitions independently, as far as like my review writing and things like that. Like that's something that I try to remain consistent with. Um, and the reflection that was required for me to really be like, okay, like you have to make some hard decisions here, as far as how much I could actually put into certain things. Because what I learned along the way was that just trying to take on more responsibilities and invite more projects into my life actually wasn't a benefit to me, to the projects that I wanted to do, or to the responsibilities that I already had. Because when you spread yourself too thin, ultimately what you're doing is taking quality and dedication and commitment away from other facets of your life. And it's not like those things need any less commitment just because you want to put it elsewhere, you know? So I ended up having, some classes, for instance, where I wasn't performing very well, or like difficulty staying focused at my day job and things like that. So what I found really helped me was to say, okay, if I have personal projects that I want to work on, like, and I know an hour a week is the best that I can give to that, then that's what I had to do. Ultimately I had to just take that hour a week, and I made it all about like that thing that I wanted to work on, and that to me is kind of what attainable really means. I don't think it means necessarily that you have to dial down your scope. I think it means that you have to accommodate your timeline and everything else with acknowledgement to the other, personal demands of your life. Like that's just the way that it works,
Yeah, absolutely. And honestly, I have another awesome book to speak even more directly and specifically to everything you just shared from your own personal experience. That can definitely help, avoid what essentially you went through, and that's called The One Thing by Gary Keller and Jay Papasan. So, as the title indicates, it basically is having you focus on one thing, but not like literally, right? Because as Mustafa identified, even though there's, he identified that throughout the process he realized that you kind of needed to hone in a little bit more. That's really what the book talks about more than anything, because look, it understands, and we all know that, there's life, there's other things that are happen, but what it does is addresses how to limit distractions. Because in a way, I think with Mustafa's case, in part, his reasoning behind it was like, hey, look, I really want to grow, and in order to grow and succeed at certain areas of my life, I need to do more. But in a way, he just shared with us, and I'm just speaking to some degree on his behalf, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong here, Mustafa. But what he was doing was almost creating more distractions for himself. And like you said, it gave him limited bandwidth and such. So what this book does, The One Thing, is really help you identify what are those key things that are really going to advance you, and how do you do the best that you could possibly to really hone in and focus on those while still addressing other things. And another thing, too, it addresses that I remember quite well when I was reading this, and it's definitely probably worth reading again. Like all these books that I have that I'm recommending here are definitely worth rereading. Is that you can't necessarily always dedicate just that time, or there's never going to be an equal balance. Like Mustafa even called out, he said, hey, look, if all I have to give for this one project is an hour a week, then so be it. But it's better than if I wasn't committing any time to it whatsoever, because it was still important to him and he was still making that time. So it talks about balance and all these other aspects and limiting distractions, and with the sole focus and goal of not just one thing, but how to do like one thing really well that's going to aid in everything else that you're doing, whether it's a business or project perspective or anything beyond that. So Mustafa, thank you so much for sharing that story, because this book, like everything that you experience, this book, The One Thing, is definitely a good way to for people to avoid that, whether they're experiencing it right now or in the future or whatever. Because I think, and this is the part that I think you can attest to here too, is everything you were doing, like, it made sense, and it seemed like that's really what you needed to do. Because sometimes I think some of these strategies that we learn about and stuff, at face value when you first learn them, they might seem counterintuitive, but they're not. They're really designed, to put it simply, to simplify the process so you can really aim to succeed at what you're doing.
Yeah. And I'm actually going to chime in there and say, too, the good thing about projects and the great thing about games, because it's such a project-based medium,
right,
is that, to get back to that T in SMART, projects end. Everything's on a timeline. So the best thing about creating more detailed timelines is that it gives you a sense of when you can roll other projects into your space, Like, that's the thing with all those commitments that I had back then, and the difficulties in kind of creating in that headspace. I kind of came to terms with the fact that, like, okay, some of these responsibilities are eventually just going to go away. Like school, for instance, it just eventually ends, and thank goodness it's over. But it ends. So at that point, you can kind of know, like, all right, once this happens, I know that what I'm doing currently takes up this much time in my week, and I can start to roll in some additional projects as it kind of ramps down, and then I have all of that time to dedicate to other things once it just goes away.
Yeah.
And the more detailed your timeline can be, the more accurate your ability to manage the timelines of other different goals.
Yeah, that's important. So what are some ways then, would you say, that are good to kind of manage those deadlines? Because honestly, like, let's face it, we see it all the time where you have teams or just solo devs that are like set deadlines for themselves, and maybe they don't always they have that deadline, but they might not always meet it. What are some good ways to kind of mitigate that from happening? And let's face it, obviously there's a lot of things that can be out of our control or whatever, that okay, we don't meet those deadlines, but what are better ways that we can maybe gain additional control to not just setting those deadlines, but also like meeting them? And I think you definitely led into there well. It's like breaking those down and probably from a manageability standpoint. But what are some other things that you can think of that can really help not just make the deadline, but also make sure that you execute and finish on those deadlines?
Yeah. So one thing that really works well for me, and I'm sorry, I'm going to get a little bit meta here, but like looking at what we do, we have a schedule and a set of deadlines that is very, in large part, dependent on the schedules and availability of other people. That's just the nature of recording something with guests. Yep. So we oftentimes kind of have to structure our deadlines in that way, and that can be in some ways compromising or conceding some level of control over what we're able to achieve in a given window. And so some workarounds that we've kind of found that I think have worked really well for us is, in the process of trying to create a backlog, always having kind of a plan B for your deliverables. And that's something that's been working really well for me too, as far as like, back to like the video stuff. Mm-hmm. I typically have a list of scripts that I know I want to work on. And I also have like a secondary list of low effort, high value deliverables. So if I know that like I just finished, working on a script that's going to amount to a 40-minute long video, I'm probably not going to finish the recording and editing for that over the course of a week. So I'm going to take whatever day I would otherwise upload and say stream a game like Hearthstone, because the process for that is me sitting at my computer and playing a game and recording and talking, which is like, of course, a level of challenge and effort and involvement, but certainly not the same level of effort that it takes for me to sit down, chop up footage, record audio, that sort of thing. In the same way that, like, us coming up with an episode topic and having a discussion between the two of us, while I consider that to be high value, and I would hope that's true of our listeners as well, it does have a different level of accessibility as far as like what it requires of us, because we don't have to do as much, say, like the research that we do with our guests to make sure that we're coming up with like really well informed, really detailed questions, because obviously we already know each other. So that like
Right.
That's an entire step that's like out of the process. And so as far as timelines go, if we know that we are, say, booking a guest that works through like a third party, like a PR agency or something like that, the scheduling process there typically takes a little bit longer than communicating with someone directly. And so that's when we maybe can, for our next kind of episode scheduled upload date, no, it might be better for us to work with one that's just the two of us kind of on a subject rather than having a guest. So I'm sorry I went off on a bit of a tangent there, but
No,
it's essentially, I think, like the plan B is my, I am like the biggest advocate for always having like a backup, and a backup that is high value and lower effort. Not necessarily in way of like cutting corners, but just different ways to buy yourself time while still meeting your deliverables in the best way you can.
yeah. So, and I think a good way to relate this too is, as basically being flexible and adaptable, right? Because things are always going to come up. But I think you make an important point there, is when we're talking about, the business and marketing of indie games, of what you, our listeners, are doing, being not just flexible in that sense, but also having something that's still going to provide value. Because and that's definitely an important part that Mustafa outlined. Because here's the thing: if you simply are just trying to do something for the sake of doing it, that and it doesn't necessarily come with that value, that can not be beneficial for you. And in fact, I think even though this is something we've been subject of here on the show a few times. And though it's not something we like to have happen, I would say it's probably better if you lose out on some level of consistency, at least if you know it's going to be temporary or very short, than to just simply put out something that's not valuable. Because, again, think about how that represents you as a whole, as a brand, as for your game. Because if you're not, then what that can do is just really limit that perception or that overall feeling of what people feel for you. And maybe it's early on and it's not that big of a deal. And I mean, it all depends on where you are in your journey, I would say. But still, to look at it from that perspective, it is really important to not just like make updates or share information or whatever it may be for the heck of it, and not having value associated with it. Because
well said.
Everybody does that. Everybody does it all the time. We see it all the time, and it's not to say that people are wrong or that their intentions are pure. It's just that they might not necessarily know that. So understanding that and really thinking and leading with value is always important. And
right. No, I'm 100% with you on that. And I will again reiterate the caveat to what I was saying earlier too, is the kind of cross section of low effort, high value. Like those two things have to be working in tandem, because otherwise low effort is just low effort.
Right.
And
it shows.
And with the high value, you might find yourself on the opposite end of the spectrum, which is high effort, high value, and then you've just taken on a second project of equivalent magnitude. And
Yeah.
nobody needs that.
All right, and I'm gonna loosely relate this to another book in